Prologue. January 1806. Brixcombe-on-the-Bay, Devon. A door slammed above stairs. A piercing screech of frustration, followed by a blood-curdling wail, penetrated the sleepless night. Lucy tugged her coverlet higher, while the blanket made her feel protected in the darkness. It did nothing to drown the ghastly sounds of her mother's fit. Her bedchamber door opened on silent hinges. A seam of candlelight fell across the plush carpet as her sister tiptoed into her room. "Are you awake, dearest?" Delilah asked, sliding into bed beside Lucy. She pulled the coverlet over their heads, then settled her arm across Lucy's waist. "You must be." Lucy turned to face her sister. As she snuggled closer, Delilah's icy toes met Lucy's warm ones at the bottom of the bed. "You're cold," Lucy said accusingly, reaching for Delilah's hands. She rubbed warmth into Delilah's fingers, the way she'd done since they were children in the nursery. "You ought to have stayed in your own bed." Above them, glass shattered. "I hate you!" Mother shouted. Another crash shook the empty halls. "I want you to die!" Lucy tightened her grip on her sister's hands. Please don't say such things about him," she silently begged her mother. "He's our father." The cacophony stopped without warning, as if Mother had heeded Lucy's plea. Only the sounds of Lucy and Delilah's rapid breathing cut the stillness. Lucy's tension began to release. "They told me!" Mother shrieked suddenly, causing both sisters to startle. "I didn't listen. I never listen. How could you?" Delilah swallowed audibly. In a loud whisper, she asked Lucy, "Who do you think they are?" Lucy rubbed her sister's hands again. She didn't want to answer. Mother spoke to few people apart from the demons who lurked in her mind. "Lucy?" Delilah prodded. In the darkness, she looked far older than her 15 years. Lucy reminded herself that Delilah, her foundation, was 3 years her junior, not the other way around. Her sister looked to her to give reason to their mother's madness, and to provide stability in a home where none could be found. "Yes," Lucy answered, kissing her sister's knuckles. Delilah shifted closer, her cotton night rail ethereal in the tent of the coverlet. "I wish Ashlyn were at home." But Ashlyn Lancester, heir to their father's estate, was miles away at university. "Better father," Lucy said, unable to keep her disgust hidden, even from Delilah. Though Mother railed as if he could hear her, father was away in London, as he'd been for most of Lucy's life. "You shouldn't say such things," Delilah chided her. "Surely it is best for him to be gone, when Mother is in one of her—" "I want him dead!" Mother screeched, oblivious to the servants who must be cowering, or her own 2 children huddled just 1 floor below. The enraged pounding of Mother's fists against her bedchamber door thumped through the ceiling, reverberating through Lucy's bedchamber and her heart. "That scurrilous blackguard!" Mother shouted, her voice clear though her mind wasn't. "How dare he leave me here? How dare he go to her?" Lucy swallowed thickly. If only her dear papa hadn't been so quick to abandon his unsteady wife. If only her older brother wasn't at school, unaware of the rapid progression of their mother's illness. "What should we do?" Delilah asked, as a loud thunk hit the floorboards above them. Racking sobs followed, as though Mother had crumpled into an incoherent heap of sorrow against the carpet. Lucy clutched her sister's hand tighter. In truth, she had no notion of the course required to restore her mother's sanity, a fact that frightened her beyond measure, for she despaired of one day meeting the same terrifying fate. A hot tear threatened to leak. Lucy squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to calm. Surely there were doctors who could help, Someone, somewhere, must know what to do. If only Aisling were here. She'd written to her brother at Cambridge, as he'd asked her to do after their mother's last violent episode. Perhaps this time a solution might be found. Nevertheless, it would take days for Lucy's letter to reach her brother, and then he must travel home. Meanwhile, their father cavorted in London with his mistresses. At the untried age of 16, she had become aware of her father's reputation for dalliance. She craved tales from town, most especially descriptions of the dashing young Marquis whose family owned the neighbouring estate, and pored over the gossip columns daily in the hopes of learning some titbit about her handsome rogue. But reading the news from town presented a risk she'd come to dread, for as she impatiently skimmed the papers for talk of Roman Alexander, Lord Montborne, she was as like to turn up an accounting of her father's sordid assignations as she was one of Roman's flirtatious interludes. Reading such accounts made her ill. Lucy sucked in a breath as another vibration indicated movement on the floor above. If only Mother didn't know of his infidelities. She always discovered a way to have the scandal sheets delivered to her hand, despite their household's best efforts to keep them away. A poor report from London meant days of despondency, followed by rage, followed by madness.
"You tiny cocked dissolute!"
The floorboards squeaked as Mother rose to her feet. A door banged open, and heavy footfalls sounded above. The house seemed to rattle as Mother charged down the hallway.
"Skirt chaser! Lecture! I'll find you, you philandering coward!"
Lucy bit her lip. She hugged Delilah close. The news from London must have been despicable indeed. Chapter 1. December 1st, 1814. Bath, Somerset. If Miss Lucy Lancester's life were a book, then surely she lived in the last blissful pages where the villain had been vanquished and the world rescued. The notion brought a smile to her lips as she dipped her quill into an inkwell. Moments later, her signature approved January's estimated expenses. She proceeded to the next piece of correspondence arranged neatly on her desk. Her position as headmistress of Bath's School for Accomplished Young Ladies satisfied her. She oversaw the tutelage of 25 bright-eyed girls. Her responsibilities extended to the employment of 2 teachers, a retainer, 4 maids, and a cook. If her school was not profitable, it was solvent. Almost as much as any of that, she adored living in the city. She raised her attention from her papers only when Mr. Mowry, her man-of-all-work, appeared in her doorway.
"Miss Lancester, you have a gentleman caller. Shall I show him in?"
"Is it Mr. Strickett?" She set her pen in the standish and began to rise. "I wasn't expecting him to collect Miss Wilhelmina until tomorrow." Wilhelmina was the last of her paying girls to retire for the winter holiday. This was good news indeed. "Perhaps I might leave Bath early and visit with my sister for an extra day." Mr. Mowry shrugged. Such indifference would have been cause for lecture in her brother's house, but this wasn't Treston's property. It was hers to manage, and she liked the uncomplicated rapport she kept with her staff.
"You take yourself off whenever you like, but I'm afraid it's not Mr. Strickett what's in the parlour," Mr. Mowry said. "The gent gave his name as Lord Montborne."
Montborne. She regarded her retainer for several speechless seconds, while her heart sped uncontrollably and her hands went to ice. No, she mustn't have heard him correctly. Roman wouldn't be here. This was Bath's School for Accomplished Young Ladies. Her school for accomplished young ladies. Roman wouldn't go to the trouble required to find her here. Why would he, when he'd never called on her once? Not in all the years she'd longed to have his attention. Mr. Mowry stood straighter.
"If you don't mind my saying, it's not like you to seem upset, Miss Lancester. I'll toss him out on his ear. Just give me the word."
If only Mr. Mowry could help her. But no, she was frighteningly alone when it came to Roman's tumultuous effect on her. While her man-of-all-work might be able to separate them physically, he could never alter what was in her heart. Roman couldn't be trusted, and she couldn't be trusted with him. It was one of the reasons she'd come here, to her fairy tale land. Roman Alexander required a wide berth. She curled her nails into her palms. See him out. Her voice was embarrassingly faint. A gleam shone in Mr. Mowry's eyes before he quit her office. He was going to enjoy this, maybe more than was proper. Her hands shook as she unfolded the next invoice. Work. She must return to her work, and forget any mention of the blue-eyed marquis she'd allowed under her skirts. Once. Her small office seemed stifling. She pushed back from her desk and stood so abruptly, her chair screeched across the marble floor. She went to the window and flung it open. Bracing both hands upon the sill, she let the crisp winter air wash over her. The busy street bustled below without pause. Wagon drivers and shopkeepers went about, ignorant of the distress occurring above them. The door to her office snapped open. She spun around. She didn't need to see the intruder to know it was him. She'd always been too aware of her brother's best friend. After 10 long years of pining for him, she knew the facts better than anyone. Roman Alexander didn't belong to her, or to any woman. Get out, she ordered tightly, straining to maintain her composure even as she relished the sight of him. Dear Zeus, he was handsome. In all the years she'd yearned for him, he'd hardly changed. He stood tall and graceful, with narrow hips and broad shoulders. If he could command attention in a London ballroom, he positively crowded the closet she called an office. Nevertheless, it wasn't his height that drew her attention first, nor was it his impeccable attire done in the first stare of fashion. It was the crown of ringlets enshrining his face. Half the men in the ton were wearing blonde wigs these days. A ridiculous attempt to emulate a man who simply couldn't be replicated. "Tisk, tisk, Miss Lancester," he said in a voice that brought to mind London drawing rooms and trysts in the dark. "I've come all this way to see you, and let me inform you, it is not an easy journey. There are god-awful hacks and ill-equipped inns and all manner of tolls to pay. The least you could do is offer me a pretty smile." "Get out," she repeated, feeling her carefully crafted discipline quickly slipping away. He cocked an eyebrow befitting Adonis, perfectly sculpted, as blonde and arched as if one of the masters had crafted it. He stood at a rakish angle in her doorway, as indolent as a summer afternoon. A pristinely gloved hand rested on the door's knob, the other held his walking stick. He flashed her a smile meant to make her insides quiver. "Why, if I didn't know better, Miss Lancester, I think you've missed me." Zeus, he was arrogant. Enough for 10 of the swains who idolized him. "Not in the least. If that is all." He took 2 steps into the room. His black greatcoat whirled as the door slammed closed behind him. "It's not all, Miss Lancester. I'd say we've barely started, wouldn't you?" The door crashed open again. Mr. Mowry burst into the office. His barrel chest heaved as if he'd struggled to keep up with the Marquis's carpet-eating strides.
"You are intruding, sir. Remove yourself at once before I am forced to seek out the watchman."
Roman's palms curved around the golden head of his walking stick. He cast a bored look over his shoulder. "That will make for an interesting report in the morning papers, Mr. Mowry." The retainer looked apprehensively at Lucy, dutifully awaiting her decision. She shook her head in a silent no. Roman was infuriatingly correct. The last thing she desired was for her name to be linked with his, or worse, for her precious girls' school to be tied to his infamous reputation. One of her teachers peered over Mr. Mowry's shoulder.
"Is aught amiss?"
Espying Roman, Miss Merriweather's eyes widened. The modish Marquis didn't fit the mould of men who usually entrusted their daughters to the school for accomplished young ladies.
"Not at all, Miss Merriweather,"
Lucy hastened to assure the woman, perhaps a bit too quickly. It was terrifying to see this man in the same room as her curious staff. No doubt they would wonder at the nature of his business with their usually staid headmistress. Lucy's ink-stained fingertips shook only a little as she pointed at him.
"Lord Montborne's estate borders my brother's in Devon. I was occupied with closing the year's accounts, but I've decided to see him after all. Please, go back to your duties, the both of you."
Mr. Mowry's forehead creased with doubt. Miss Merriweather's face shined with misplaced excitement, and Roman's leisurely, satisfied grin raised Lucy's hackles.
"Go on."
She made a shooing motion at her staff.
"Close the door behind you."
Doing so might cause even more gossip than arguing in front of them would have done, but she couldn't let Roman make clever, needling remarks in front of her employees. She waggled her fingers again. With obvious reluctance, Mr. Mowry exited. As he drew the door shut, Lucy caught Miss Merriweather's wistful sigh at her last glimpse of the Marquis. A more misplaced appreciation couldn't be named. Roman was a villain, not a hero. A truth Lucy had learned the hard way, even when she'd hoped for so long he might prove to be. Well, she wasn't special to him. He lumped her in with the others, a warm, willing woman, indistinguishable from any other lady who yearned for him.